Welcome to Let's Get Writing. I'm your host, Kathryn Taylor, and this is the show where we share the stories behind the stories. And today is no exception. My guest is a wonderful writer and author of 16 books, and he came all the way from Hare Bay to our set here at Let's Get Writing. Welcome, Gary Collins. Gary,
good morning.
So good to see you again.
Before we begin the interview, when you called last night, I was actually cleaning fresh mackerel right out of the sea. It was given me by a good friend of mine, and I decided to share some with you.
Thank you so much. I love fish, and I like mackerel. Not everyone does. I love it. And it reminds me of, this is such a Newfoundland thing.
Yeah, it's a giving thing.
Honestly, because when I first moved back here, I would look in the fridge and there'd be something, and I go, "What's this?" Oh, that's seal flippers frozen in a Pepsi container. And then there'd be something else, and I'd be, "What's this?" "Oh yeah, no, that's bottles of moose meat." I was like, "What's going on?" "Oh no, people bring this into the office." And so here we are. Yeah. I love it. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Gary, we also have something to celebrate. This is your third visit to Let's Get Writing. But when I came up with the idea for the show back in 2016 and then started filming 2017, you were one of my first guests on the show. And almost actually it's going to be a year, and we just found this out. A year, the exact day, December 6th, the first show I did with you was 2017, and this show is going to run December 6th, 2023.
Wow.
6 years.
That's pretty cool.
It is very cool. And I think you get the same shirt on.
Probably anyway, it is. I love red shirts.
Yeah, well, red shirts, good color for you, Gary.
Yeah.
Let's have a quick look at a clip from that show and just take us back. Well, what's one of the key pieces of advice that you do give to people?
Well, just yesterday I was at an event signing a book, and this lady came along and said, "Oh my God, I'd like to write about my father. He's 90 years old, and he has so much stories in his head, and he soon won't be with us." Mm-hmm. So my advice to any writer, young or old, who are aspiring to write down their family history or come up with a story of your own, but especially family history, is get it down. Mm-hmm. Get it on paper. It doesn't matter if you don't like the editing or its grammatical effects. That will be ironed out. Get the information down while you can.
Gary, that was amazing. What do you think looking at that?
Well, it was. I had never thought of it. I knew it was a while ago, but I didn't. Yeah, I know it was pre-COVID.
Yeah, and the advice that you gave, like to people who want to write a book, write about your family, something you know.
Yeah.
And I think you've actually, in this book that I'm holding in my hands, Away from My Island, the true story of Eliza Gill, you took your own advice.
I did.
You did.
Yes. Well, it's a story. I can't say it's been 51 years in the making, but it's a story that I was reluctant to write. And as you mentioned earlier, I've been writing I've written 16 books. Mm-hmm. This by far was the most difficult. It's because it directly involved my family in a tragedy, which happened to the main character, Eliza Gill, as well. It was very difficult, very emotionally to do. And I won't get into describing any more intimate details at where you've read, any more than it's already been said. Mm-hmm. I'm not going back into that situation anymore, but we can talk in generalities, anything you like about the book.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah. Gary, one thing that strikes me as you say that, I think for anyone writing a book, it's still a very personal thing to do. Particularly if it's about your own family, but you still put yourself out there and into a book. All the books you've written, would you agree that like maybe take yourself back to the first one? Was that the hardest one to put out there?
Well, the first one was the hardest because I was a rookie at it, mm-hmm. Still a rookie. And I was afraid of people reading my stuff. This one for a different reason. Mm-hmm. When we decided, my publisher, Margot Cranford of Flanker Press, mm-hmm. she knew about this incident a long time ago. And she always would insist that, you should really write that story. And I told her in no uncertain terms that I never ever would. But as time went on, and why I said 51 years, because up to 51 years after the incident as stated in this book, I walked on that ground for the first time. And I found an artifact that came from the disaster which happened, and the piece of glass, like a piece from a lustre jug. And it was saying, why don't you tell our stories? Like, we lived, we were here.
Mm-hmm.
Will you just leave a blank between our birth and our death, or will you tell what went on between? So I talked over with my wife Rose, and we decided to write it. Whether or not I would have it published, we weren't sure. I didn't know if I wanted that expose
Mm-hmm.
of something so intimate in our lives. But after we had it written, and we talked about this thing, and I had already previously talked to my publisher, and they were all for it, of course. So then Rose and I reasoned that everybody who knew us, the family, knew about the incident anyway. So like if you were going to read it, or somebody else on the West Coast or anywhere in Canada, we're already getting copies gone, sent to lots of places in Canada. To them, it's just another emotional and tragic story.
Mm-hmm.
So then we decided to write Away from My Islands and just let it go as it is.
Yeah. And you know, it's funny how life at times can present those signs to us. As writers, I think we're very sensitive to that. You finding that piece of glass, holding it in your hand, it's almost as though the universe spoke to you and said, Gary, it's time.
Yeah.
It's time.
Yeah.
You know, that the story be told. And we're eternally grateful that you told this story.
Oh, I am now.
Yeah.
Now that it's over, you know.
Yeah.
It was as you'll see when you read the book, I won't let it away, but it was a release for me as well, because over the 51 years, I've been doubtful certain things that happened, but it was a big release. Like, you face your fears, you've accepted them. It's cliche, I know, but it works sometimes.
Yeah, it works a lot of times. Yeah. Gary, Away from My Island, what island are we talking about?
We are talking about, in this case, 3 islands. The first island Eliza lived on, where she was born, is Silver Fox Island. And then when she got married, they moved to Pinter's Island, which both are islands on the north side of Bonavista Bay, in the Newtown, Centerville, Indian Bay area. So then finally, they were destined to leave the island of Newfoundland. So Away from My Island could be collectively, or which island, whichever one you chose, actually. So she was a very courageous woman. And it was long after her death before I realized that, much to my shame. Mm. And so many intricacies in the book that I heard from her vaguely. I could have, if I'd asked the questions at the time, I could have made it much more intimate. But I was a young man and knew it all, and you know how that goes. So
yeah, we're all guilty of that.
I didn't ask the questions.
Yeah. I could sit here and say, I wish I had asked my mother this, or my father this, or my grandmother. I think we're all guilty of that.
We're all guilty.
Let's take a moment here to remind people, ask the questions, sit down, have the conversations. As Newfoundlanders, we are so good at these conversations, at storytelling.
Yeah.
And yet, occasionally.
Yeah, it's sad. I grew up with men coming to my mother's kitchen in winter nights and visiting my father, and they smoked cigarettes, and they'd leave the snow on their boots under the table, and the lamp glowed, and they'd always tell stories about bears and schooners that went adrift on bare poles, and I was an ardent listener. But I find now that these men have taken their art with them to a large extent. There's a lot of Newfoundland writers now put it on paper, a lot of really good writers. But you don't hear the in the kitchen coffers like you used to. I miss that a lot. I'm a bit different. I still, when we have Christmas parties and stuff, I'm not always the one who tells a few stories, and I just love it. Yeah. You know, so.
Yeah, I love it too. And I recall from growing up, that's what I remember. Our family gatherings, the storytelling. I mean, my father would tell a story, and it would be the same story, versions thereof, every year, but we wanted to hear it. About the time the bear chased them up the tree, or
Yeah,
Uncle
that's right.
Max ate all the fish bait on the way to the
That's right.
fishing hole.
Yeah.
These kind of stories just, I don't know, they're part of us, they warm our hearts, but you
Yeah.
capture them so well in your
Yeah.
books.
I've been asked, I've had several interviews, and they'll ask me what this book is about, and you think you can sum up the wholesome of a book in a minute or so. It's easy, it's not easy to do. But Eliza was at 11 years old, you can imagine. 11 years old in 1922 or whatever it was, to be not asked but told, you're going to Labrador to cook for 6 men, and by the way, you're taking your 9-year-old brother with you. And you can imagine a schooner in Labrador in the 20s or even up to the 50s or 60s. There's no privacy, there's no intimacy for a woman. The toilet was a common bucket, and hardship, and she was expected to pull teeth, take hooks of the flesh, and
Sew
cook.
up flesh.
And then cook, right? So, and I never asked her about that. And one of the other things I regret in this book, as the reader will see as they go, the things that happen. They ended up during the war years in Gander, and her husband was the first butcher for Joey Smallwood, Joey Smallwood's piggery. And from there, they went to Toronto. And this is what I regret asking her more, I should have asked her more about. Because I remember Aunt Eliza, I always called her Aunt Eliza. She was telling me that in Toronto, she lived next door to a woman whose name was Mrs. Weiner, who survived the Jewish Holocaust. And they talked to each other through a picket missing in the fence. And she had the number on her left for number from Auschwitz. And when I started to write, I was fascinated with this. So in the book, there's 2 first persons. The first person narrative, Eliza, and then the first person author. Doesn't say who it is. You'll find out later in the book it is me. Actually, and our relationship. But the point for that was, Eliza would know the stats about all the boats that went to Labrador, like 8,000 boats in the 20s. She would know that. She would know about the ramifications of the Jewish situation and Hitler in war. So for that reason, to tie in the more intricate remarks, I used the first person of my own self. But Eliza did all the first person dialogue, of course.
And I noticed that when I was reading the book, and I would see author at the top of the chapter. I always look at how people label their chapters.
Yeah.
And, so it was interesting to get that perspective. I will tell you, when I started to read the book, I was I almost had to put it down, because I thought, how hard was life? Like, how could someone send their daughter at that age off to Labrador in that situation? I thought, how hard was life in Newfoundland back in those days?
It wasn't unique to Eliza. It was a common thing. That was a common thing for, especially boys. Like, you're going to Labrador, and the boys would want to go. And Eliza loved it. I mean, she told us, Rose and I, her daughter, many times. She just loved it. She loved the islands, all of them. But she wanted more for her family than fishing and the way the truck system of life, the truck system, the way to live, and subsistence farming. She wanted something better for kids' education and so on. So she was always the one who prompted her husband. Her husband was a teacher, and he was a very intelligent man. And she was always the one prompting them to move further and further until they had to move back to their island. And when they came back, there was no going back to Silver Fox Island or Princess Island. That had long been vacated. So now she had to, her husband was in a bad medical situation. So she had to survive the best way she knew in a little town of Hare Bay. And that's where she subsequently died, a very tragic and a very heroic death.
Gary, when you were writing the book, and you mentioned Rose, and I know Rose is a big part of your business in writing.
My first editor.
I'm dealing with Rose all the time. Every time I have to check with Rose.
I write the books. Rose got to sell them.
Rose is amazing. Rose is indeed amazing. But even more so, this was her mother and,
Yeah.
and her father, and, that it had to be like, how did you approach this? Did you two sit and have tea and discuss it, or how much was she a part of all of
I'll
this?
tell you how I did this particular thing. It's a good question. You got to say that sometimes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's a really good question. I've never written the end of a book first before. I know authors who do. And I couldn't figure out why you would write the ending first. But when I was a young man, my father and I started a logging business with horse and sleds. And he would always say, do the hardest thing first. In this case, he would say, the log that's furthest away, the heaviest one, we'll lug that one to the sled first. So then after that, they all get easier. So I wrote the most difficult part of the book, which was for me cruel, taxing, a yoke around my neck for 50 years. I wrote that first. And then before I did any more of the book, Rose and I went over. Rose is my first editor. She reads the first 1,000 words. And she couldn't speak. She couldn't speak. And I was cursed with my ability to do descriptive writing. And I had to hold myself back, not to be too descriptive, more than I could bear. So Rose cried and cried and cried, and we both cried, and I put it down and said, I'm not going to do any more with it. I went back to it, and I went down by the water, and I sized up the situation where it was very appropriate to this book, as the reader will see when they go. And I went back to it, and I finished it. And but Rose was the biggest part of this. As a matter of fact, I say one of those days I'm going to write another book called It's Okay, But. Because when she reads the first 1,000 words, she says, it's okay, but. And of course, but is where all the details are.
Oh, Rose. It's okay, but I can definitely see that. And that's a book you definitely need to write.
Yeah, maybe I will.
It will maybe a little more humor.
Yeah. Well, actually, a lady the other day wanted me to write a humorous book, and I said, well, I'm a very friendly, funny guy, but I'm just not going to write humor.
Well, you never know.
No, well, I never know now.
Never say never.
No.
Now, you mentioned you sent me some photographs, and I asked for some photographs. And one of them, there was a picture of this lovely little cabin, I guess, but it hardly looks like a cabin. Chalet might be a better word.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
It's a little place that we, I might as well tell you, I'll let you just must note that the tragedy involved one of our sons, whose name was Nicholas. And we have a landing, we call it Nicky's Landing, built on the scene with the final tragedy of this book. And it's not a big place, it's not quaint, it's not a mausoleum, not a place to go to, be morbid. It's a place for me to go and play guitar and have a drink of wine. And Rose and I barbecue there almost every weekend, regardless of the weather. If it's snowstorm, doesn't make any difference. And it's where I wrote this book. This is where I wrote 99.9% of this book. And it was on the wall in this little cabin, this Nicky's Landing, there's a photograph, a painting, drawn by Ed Roach, one of Newfoundland's best painters. And I think it was taken from a photograph of Silver Fox Island back in its day, complete with schooner, fish on the flakes, and two-story houses, salt box houses, still being lived in, people on the go. And it was given to me by my daughter, Robin, another one who survived this tragedy. And it's on the wall of this little landing. And it's just a simple lumber we sawed ourselves and cut ourselves. But it's like Shangri-La. And for me, it's therapeutic. It's a therapeutic place to go. The moon shines, I call it the moon path, we've seen in this book. And Eliza used to call the trail of the moon path. Mm-hmm. So I always call it now the moon path shines on Nicky's Landing. Every night it's possible.
Mm. Well, I'm glad we could share these images with people to see, what you're talking about, because it's a truly beautiful, serene place.
It is.
Yeah, it truly is.
And you're welcome to come there.
Well, thank you. And you have offered
I have.
this to me, and I
Yeah.
am coming this summer
Yes.
with the motorhome. I'm plugging in.
Yeah.
And I'm coming to visit. Maybe I'll do some writing.
Well, yeah,
but I want a barbecue.
Actually, since the last time I spoke, we have power in the house. You can literally plug it in now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. All
Yeah.
right. Well, count on that. Count on that. Oh, my goodness. Gary, what's the most rewarding thing for you? I mean, writing a book is not an easy thing, and again, depending on the subject matter. But what's the most rewarding thing for you in this path you've chosen?
You mentioned earlier that whenever you write, it's always hard on you, something about yourself. And there's a part of you in everything you do, even if you're writing fiction. There's a part of you. And I've never written true fiction. I've written some novels, but they're all based on fact. And I find it now, like, I've already talked to my publisher now about another book, and I get this urge to not reveal stuff and not expound about me, things that I've done so much. But I just love the feeling of having this revealed to people who are not aware of the situation. And like we said earlier about talk to you don't have to have a grandfather sailed to Labrador. You could have your grandfather working in Buchan's mine, or he could have been a hockey player or whatever he was. Mm-hmm. There's always memories. And you'll get just a certain kind of feeling just to have people say, boy, I sure do remember that day. Or I didn't know that. Or I didn't know that about my mother. This story in this book for the first part could be anybody's grandmother on any island, anywhere in Newfoundland. I mean, if you're fishing and you're drying fish on the flakes, and you're taking them to market, and instead of getting cash, you're getting a piece of lace back or something to make a dress. It could be on O'Dare and on it for that matter. Mm-hmm. Just the way life was.
They were never out of the red in the book, and this is crazy, but I try to understand this. The people are so indebted to the fish merchants. There was never money. There was a piece of paper. And when I said that, my husband said, oh yeah, I saw my father with a piece of paper. Sure. And that this would come and you could go to the store owned by the merchant. Yeah. Pretty good system. They determine what they're going to pay you, and they determine what they're going to charge you. I mean, there's so much in our history books. But I mean, the system, and again, I found the language you chose to use also in the book. There were many words I didn't.
There was
didn't even hear before.
That's a good thing too, because first when I started writing, and I tried to get in as many Newfoundland colloquialism as I could, slang. But as I've got more mature with the writing process, I guess I refuse to portray our language as idiotic. So I just put in enough for flavor. I mean, I have no excuse, or I'm not ashamed of my grandfather's language. It's a wonderful thing. I told a guy in the States one time, and he said, "You are the guys who bastardized the English language." And I said, "Excuse me? We are the ones who gave you your language. We were here first." And he said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" I said, "Well, it's well known in Newfoundland that Columbus stopped on the way lying St. John's for a barrel of rum." "Oh, is that right?" he said. So, in the story for that. But, I put enough in for flavor.
And it is kind of the challenge sometimes of writing with a dialect and writing the way that we do. Yeah. How do you get that balance? But you did it very subtly. But there were use of words there that words I had never heard, and I'm pretty familiar. But that there were words that I thought, oh, that's different. What does that mean? And
it's like Eliza being churched. That was a thing in the day, that if you had a child out of wedlock, you were being churched. You weren't recognized by the church. God gave you the child, but the church wouldn't accept it until you had to go and have your womb redeemed or sanctified and made good again in the eyes of the church. Nothing to do with God. So church was a big word. A lot of your listeners will recognize that one.
There was a lot of power a lot of power that the church held
Oh.
over the small,
Yeah.
as we all know, and
Even
have
today.
yes, and have lived through.
Yeah.
So this has been a wonderful story that just gives us an insight into our rich history
Yeah.
and the difficult things that people have gone through, the tragedies. And it's so wonderful that you wrote this book. I know it was hard.
Thank you.
I
Yeah.
just want to thank you. And I think that there will be so many people. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge Flanker Press, because they have done such a wonderful job capturing these stories. It's something that they seek, they find, and they bring it to us between the
Yes.
covers of books.
Yeah.
So Flanker, thank you for what you do, and thank you, Gary, for your writing.
It's been a pleasure.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. And any final word before you go?
I'm asked what would you expect people to take from this book? And aside from the tragedy that is the climax of the book, it's a way of life that was, and you will never see again. You'll never see that way of life. And I'm so proud that I have the knowledge in my head, and I've a collection of many old-fashioned books, old books. I can portray this and bring it back at least for a time. And I never thanked Eliza enough when she was alive. I didn't realize it. I was young and I knew all the answers. But she had the answers. And Eliza was the one who saved us all. And I really would like the people to read this book just for the compassion of it.
Nicely said, Gary.
Yeah.
And
Enjoy the mackerel.
thank you. I will very much. I'll think of you tonight as I sit down to dine. And folks, thank you so much for joining us here on Let's Get Writing. It is such a pleasure to bring you this show, and I enjoy immensely every author I sit down with and meet. And if you enjoy it, please leave your comments on the Rogers TV Grand Falls Windsor page or on my page on Facebook, and share and subscribe to my YouTube channel. It all helps, and we'll keep the stories coming. Have a wonderful day.